Mirror's Edge Catalyst is perhaps the single most disappointing game I've come across. It's by no means a bad game, but as a big budget, part reboot, part prequel follow-up to a cult classic, it was a terrible letdown. It wasn't satisfying as a sequel, with nothing particularly new to offer, and as a reboot it suffered from many of the same problems that marred the original, with a few new ones to boot. To explain why I found Catalyst so disappointing, I need to return to the first game. Mirror's Edge had a focused, albeit compromised vision, a vision defined by its beautiful, minimal aesthetic, and its equally focused, and arguably simplistic, gameplay loop. That vision was, on the other hand, marred by a dull narrative and truly awful gunplay tacked onto an already weak combat system. Its gameplay was very simple on the surface, but there was a surprising amount of depth in your abilities to maintain and transfer momentum, and it remained satisfying throughout the game as a result. People remember Mirror's Edge in many different ways, and it was certainly a very flawed game. But if there was one dominant element to that first game that most remember fondly, it was its minimalism. I'm not just talking about its visuals or soundtrack, though both reflect the minimalist approach with which the game as a whole was designed. Rather, I'm specifically talking about its gameplay. Each action was predictable, which objects in the game world could afford such actions was immediately obvious, highlighted as they were in red, and the rest faded into the background. It was a simple game that worked wonderfully for its simplicity, while still allowing more complex routes and interactions for those that wished to explore them. As it stood, it was a game loved by those who it clicked with, and forgotten by almost everyone else. And then DICE began to develop a new Mirror's Edge title. So, what do you do with a sequel? Most sequels, regardless of form, thematic concerns, or the reception of the original, opt to work by a simple formula. Expand on what people liked, ignore what people didn't. Mirror's Edge Catalyst follows in this vein, with a few exceptions. People didn't like the guns in the first game, so they're gone. People liked the movement, so now there's more to move around on. People didn't like the flash-styled cutscenes, so they were replaced with a pretty, if a little soulless, standard CG affair. People didn't like the narrative, so
It's like the inside of my spine is itching.
An itch doesn't hurt.
Could help induce comparative pain.
No!
I have the grid print. Give it to me.
Okay, the plot's even weaker now, but for the most part the direction the team were headed in seemed to be the right one. Then there are a few decisions and gameplay tweaks that sounded perfect on paper, but lacked in execution. A combat system that scaled damage based on your momentum sounds like a perfect fit, but ultimately only served to halt any momentum you might have had whenever there's more than one goon. The idea of a large map that opened up Metroidvania style with new equipment sounded like a brilliant direction to take, but unfortunately the gear that opened up each new area typically halted the momentum that was so key to the gameplay, and the size of the map led to frustrating load times. No new areas were ever opened up by newly acquired skill. They were only ever opened up by new gear provided for a new story mission. There wasn't any of the interesting backtracking of a Metroidvania game, instead there was just backtracking. Ultimately, as a sequel, I think it falls short, and as a reboot it didn't change enough about the core mechanics or narrative beats to establish itself as anything new either. Whether the fault of DICE or EA I can't say, but I get the impression that in development there was the path of a direct sequel or the path of a reboot, and the resulting game tried to be both, but ultimately failed to satisfy on either front. In light of this, the one major addition that sets Catalyst apart is the one I'd like to discuss: its open world. There are two major issues I see here. Problem 1. A two-way street. Catalyst has some fantastic moments that evoked what the first game inspired. They all had one thing in common though: they occurred in story missions with mission-specific level design. Catalyst treats its open world like a hub connecting all the main story missions, with only a few that take place in that open world, and it's in these main missions that you'll find the best parts of Catalyst. The reason I think this is the case is simple. You only need to travel one way, giving the developers more time to fine-tune the experience of moving through a particular path, rather than ensuring that same path was a two-way street. It's no secret that backtracking in games is frustrating when done poorly, and while certain games like the Metroid series can make clever use of such backtracking, Catalyst doesn't. As you go from one mission to another, you find yourself travelling over specific bridges, paths, ladders and ziplines over and over, and because there are only so many of these bridges or paths, you'll often have to travel a long way over routes you're already familiar with just to get to these specific points. Mirror's Edge had a campaign that felt a little short at roughly 6 hours, but it never repeated content during that time. Catalyst, on the other hand, felt really long. Over the 14 hours I spent with the game, I found myself frustrated, traversing the same dull routes that make up its open world over and over. Problem 2. Runner's Vision. With an open world, it becomes a lot easier to become lost, a lot harder to figure out where to go. The first game opted to guide you with a system dubbed Runner's Vision, highlighting specific parts of the environment in red. Depending on who you ask, such a system was wonderfully effective and beautiful, or overbearing and frustrating. I tend more towards the former when it comes to the original, but not so with the implementation of Runner's Vision in Catalyst. In the original, specific objects were highlighted in red, and a wealth of smaller cues informed you where to head. How to use those highlighted objects to get to your goal was up to you to decide. I think some don't give the original enough credit regarding its signposting. More than just splashing some red around, there were cues that told you where to head. There wasn't really such thing as a dead end in Mirror's Edge. If a door opened up onto a balcony with sloping glass ahead of you, you're supposed to jump onto that glass. If there's a plank forming a ramp, there'll be something to land on when you jump the gap. None of this works in an open world, of course. There have to be dead ends and sudden drops, but the visual cues don't change with these environments, and you end up dying more often than feels fair as a result. At least that's the case until you turn on the more aggressive level of Runner's Vision, one that now, on top of highlighting key objects in your path, also places arrows around the environment and a red stream of triangles guiding you. With this turned off, it's nigh impossible to figure out where to head, and with it turned on, you spend a lot less time absorbing the beautiful surroundings you find yourself moving through. That could have been an issue with the first game too, but because it stuck to brutalist architecture with straight lines and bold splashes of colour, it was just as beautiful, if not more, when viewed at speed, and the initial take on Runner's Vision sat very nicely in that aesthetic. It's easier to pick out blocks of colour than small splashes of it, easier to navigate simple geometry than complex landscapes. Catalyst, on the other hand, switches visual styles quite often, and this doesn't only make it harder to assess where to head at speed, but also less appealing while you're moving through it. Whole areas blur into a mess of pink and purple that's quite ugly, despite how good looking those same areas are when you actually stop. The visuals of the game look their best when you aren't moving, and the gameplay works best when you are. As a result, I feel there's a disconnect between the two, a disconnect the developers tried to make up for with the new aggressive take on the comparatively subtle Runner's Vision of the first game. It had to be there with an open world, but I don't think that excuses the poor signposting that still plagues the story missions. The first game had occasional issues in this regard too, but it was easier to excuse when Runner's Vision was comparatively unobtrusive. All things considered, I don't think Catalyst is a bad game, but there were so many questionable decisions that just didn't work. The signposting throughout the entire game was a mess. The new gear wasn't so much a new way to interact with the environment, but rather a glorified doorway to a new area. The shift to an open world made loading times far longer than they ever were in the first game, and the narrative doubled down on the stiff caricatures of the original, with now even less likeable, relatable, or even interesting characters.
All right. I'll see you there, Faith. Oh, and don't get lost.
Catalyst is so disappointing because it could have been the sequel the first game deserved, or a reboot that fixed the issues of the original, but ultimately it was neither. As a sequel, it brought almost nothing new to the table, and as a reboot, it made many of the same mistakes that plagued the original. Both Catalyst and the first game sit on the edge of something incredible, and even though I think Catalyst was a step in the wrong direction, I still want to see more from the series. Mirror's Edge offers a vision no other series has, and if I can be so excited by the games that almost achieve that vision, the game that eventually does achieve it will be something truly special. Before you go, I'd just like to send you the way of a few other videos you may find interesting if you like this one. This is something I plan on doing in future videos as well, so I've left links to a few videos I enjoyed relevant to this topic in the description below. And while you're there, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How does Catalyst stack up to the original? Cheers, have a good one.